that graphic that Kimberly made. We are talking about the sayings of Jesus this summer, and everybody's got a favorite, right? Anybody have a favorite thing that Jesus said? Have a favorite Jesus quote? If you're online, you can type it in online. How about do not be afraid? Or come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Abide in my love, and I'll abide in you. Beautiful sayings, right? We love them. They're like summer books. They just make us feel good. But Jesus said some hard things also, and we have to look at those as well. Some of the hard sayings, things like judge not, lest you be judged. Forgive one another as you expect God to forgive you. It's hard to do, isn't it? It's harder for a rich man to get through the eye of a needle harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to get through the eye of a needle. It's hard to even say, much less to accept, right? We stumble on some of these. They're no fun to talk about. They're really no fun to preach about. But the reality is, if you're going to talk about the things that Jesus said, we need to embrace some of the hard things as well. Because in any relationship, we sometimes need to push ourselves. We need to have the hard conversations to grow and be challenged. And so we're looking at some of the hard things Jesus said also. And I think one of the hardest things that Jesus said is also one of the things he's quoted as saying the most often. Jesus said you have to lose your life in order to gain it. You have to lose your life in order to gain it. It's counterintuitive, right? And we can look at the story of Jesus and we can say, literally for Jesus, that meant losing his life in order to gain it. We know that story of death and resurrection that Ashley just sang about so beautifully. But most often when Jesus is quoted as saying this, he's not talking about himself. He's talking about us, his followers. What does that mean for us? You have to lose your life in order to gain it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all quote Jesus as saying this, and that's unusual. The quote is actually used 6 different times across all 4 Gospels. And when you see a quote, the exact same words pop up in different ways in different Gospels, it's something that scholars call multiple attestation. It means that it was a saying that probably circulated very, very early in the tradition. It doesn't have what's called literary dependence. A lot of things the stories that are told in the Gospels will be the same, the stories, and we'll say, okay, Luke and Matthew probably read that in Mark and then used the story again. Or perhaps John took it from another place, and they're using similar stories. But this particular quote, they use the same quote, but they place it in a different context, which means they probably all had the quote from different places, probably oral tradition. Think back in history, paper was rare at that time. And so when Jesus first died, people talked about what he said, and they shared those things orally. Think about today when someone passes away. So often in a church, as soon as someone in a family dies, one of the first things you do is call the pastor, right? And one of us will go and sit down with the family, and we'll talk about the person who's just passed away. And the thing we hear are stories that aren't necessarily written down, but every member of the family will say, remember, Grandpa always said. They're those prized pieces of wisdom that we share. This is one of those prized pieces of wisdom from Jesus that everyone was repeating, and yet it's a difficult saying. So why would such a difficult saying have been repeated so often by the early church? Each author of a gospel account uses it differently. And I think we can learn something interesting by looking at the ways the story and the quote are used in different places. In the Gospel of Luke, my favorite gospel author, Luke is always concerned about our relationship to our stuff. He's very concerned about the ways we use our money and the ways we are attached to our things. He quotes Jesus in the 17th chapter, and he says it this way. He says, on that day, anyone on the housetop who has belongings in the house must not come down to take them away. And likewise, anyone in the field must not turn back. Remember Lot's wife, in case you don't remember her, is the one who turned back to look at the city, to look at her stuff, and then sort of froze. He's saying, don't look back. Those who try to make their life secure will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it. And I think Luke is trying to say the same thing that he has said in lots of other places in his gospel, that our lives are not made up of the abundance of our possessions. It's something Luke is always counseling us about. When he talks about people sitting on their rooftops, it's a really beautiful and appropriate summer image. In Palestine at this time, homes had flat roofs so that people could sit on the roof and catch the breeze. Imagine a muggy day like today with no air conditioning. You want to catch whatever bit of a breeze you can catch. So they would sit up on their roof to catch the breeze, sort of like our front porches or our screened-in porches today. And I love that image for summer. One of my favorite places to be in the summer is sitting on my screened-in porch with my family. I had my kids home last weekend. My daughter was in town for a baby shower, and they had their friends in from out of town. And I had them all gathered up on my screened-in porch, and I love my porch. I love the porch itself, and I love the sound of my fountain outside, and I love the hellebores in my garden. I love the cheese plates I put my cheese on. I love everything about my screened-in porch. I love that stuff. And I don't think Luke is saying that it's not okay to love some of those things, to take enjoyment from our homes and our stuff. But I think he is saying that we not pay so much attention to our stuff, that in those magical moments when God passes by, we're not willing to look up from our stuff and see God. Our stuff is okay, but our lives are not made up in the abundance of those possessions. We should not be so in love with our homes full of stuff that we can't look up and see the people in our neighborhoods, the people in our community, the beauty of God's creation. Our lives are not made up of the abundance of our stuff, as much as the advertising industry tries to convince us otherwise. Luke tells us over and over again that we can't store up our treasures forever, right? Do not store up your treasure here on earth. Rather, store up your treasure in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, right? We can't have our hearts tied up in our stuff. John uses the quote also, but in his 12th chapter, and he uses it in a completely different but also appropriate summer image. It's a farming image. John says this, he says, "Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life will lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life." A grain of wheat dies to bear fruit. Something has to die in order for the fruit to grow, right? This is the case with all of agriculture. It's useful to know that when John talks about bearing fruit, he's often talking about the ways that community is built. Just as Luke has a focus on our stuff and our possessions, John has an emphasis here on community, what it takes to build community. And what he's saying is that one small seed can grow into so much more. I remember when my kids were little, vacation Bible school ages, and every summer we would get tomato seeds, and we would start them out inside, the little tiny seed, and we'd plop it in the dirt and grow it in a windowsill, and then we'd move it outside, and we would harvest, hopefully, the little cherry tomatoes. Anybody do this with your kids, these little at-home agriculture projects? And part of what we're teaching them is that out of that little bitty seed, something bigger can grow. John is telling us that our lives are like that also, when we're willing to let go of one thing and embrace the next. We all have talents, right? Gifts. One of the things we've talked about Salem, we've done these surveys and workshops to talk about what our spiritual gifts are, what our talents are. But if we have those talents and we don't share them, they're useless, right? Think about Ashley if she only sang in the shower. I'm sure it would be beautiful, but it'd be a loss to the community, right? Imagine the holy smokers. If you guys only smoked meat for yourselves, right? It'd be a beautiful meal for you, but the community would be at a loss. Our gifts are meant to be shared. John is saying we have to die to self a little bit, not just use our talents for our own pleasure and our own glory, but for the broader community. We need to share. We need to die to self in order to give more fully to the people around us, our church, our city, our larger community. Together, we bear more fruit than we ever could alone if we hoarded our gifts to ourselves. We ought not hoard our stuff, and we ought not hoard our gifts. Just as Luke called us to be willing to share our stuff, John calls us to share ourselves, our talents, our gifts. Sometimes we give up a part of ourselves to be a part of something larger. And like the seed, we have to grow in order to bear fruit. Paul expands on this in his letter to the Galatians when he says we have to let some things within us die. greed, selfishness, idolatry, quarreling, anger, in order to make space for the fruit of the Spirit to grow: love, joy, peace, patience, self-control. Anybody ever have two trees growing up too close to each other? I live in a house that's 100 years old. And when it was a brand new house, I can just picture people planted all these beautiful dogwoods around my house. But they were little baby trees, and they planted them too close together. And all these years later, we sometimes hit this point where two trees are going to die unless one of them comes down, because there's not enough breathing room. There's not enough room for the roots. There's not enough room for the branches because they've grown up. Sometimes as we grow up, we have to let some things go in order to grow the things that really matter to us. We let go of some things to make space for others. Change isn't always easy. Moving from one way of being to another isn't always easy, but John's telling us that it's essential. We have to let go of some things in order to make space for others. And it's not just bad stuff that we have to let go of sometimes. In Matthew's rendering of the quote, we're reminded that Jesus wants us to love nothing more than we love Jesus. He says it this way in chapter 10 of Matthew. He says, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Now that's really challenging. How does the guy who says, "Let the little children come to me," turn around and say, "If you love your children more than me, you're not really a follower"? How are we called to make sense of that? I think it helps to remember that Jesus was living in an extremely patriarchal society. Your role in your family and the role of your family, its status in the larger community, dictated everything you could do. Who you were was entirely wrapped up in whose daughter, whose son, whose father, whose brother, whose spouse. Everything was related to that patriarchal society. And Jesus was calling people beyond that rigid way of being. We've talked so often about the ways Jesus calls disciples, and they are unexpected. Jesus calls women. Wasn't expected in that culture. He called fishers of fish in the ocean to become fishers of men, disciples. That wasn't expected of someone who had no education and no status in society. Jesus is calling ordinary people to do extraordinary things. But in order to do that, they have to transition from one way of seeing themselves into another way. He's calling people to look beyond the roles assigned by their families or by their career or their place in culture, to think beyond the patriarchal society, to think beyond the Roman rule and the structures imposed at that time. And I think it's important to look at the exact words that he uses. He says, "Whoever loves family more than me will have trouble." He's not saying you can't love your family, but he's saying, where do you draw your primary identity? How do you identify yourself? In Jesus' day, identity would have been drawn from family, much the way we draw it from career today. What's the first question you hear at a cocktail party? What do you do, right? And we mean career. What's the second one you hear, if not the first? Where'd you go to school, right? We identify ourselves in all these different ways. And I think what Jesus is trying to say is that your identity is bigger than that. You can be more than you expected to be. You are not tied back by the constraints that society places on you, who your people were, who your school was, the title on a business card. I've drawn my identity from so many places in my life. And I am in a chapter right now where I've thought of myself as a mom for so long, and now all of a sudden I have to think of myself as a grandma. It's a completely new identity. For years and years, I was bivocational. I split my time between being a lawyer and a pastor. And of all the things I said I would never do, it was to be in this building full time. And yet here I am. And I think what Jesus is recognizing is no matter how important our identities are, the roles that we play are to us, we need to be prepared for them to change. Our children grow, our family structures change. If we're really following Jesus, our careers may change. The things that matter to us change and grow over time. I think we're being called to anticipate that and not be so wrapped up in a particular identity that we refuse to embrace the thing that God might be calling us to. Jesus' words resonate with me. Your identity had better be bigger than a particular role in a particular family or a particular career or a particular degree, because life is always changing. We're called to new things. We're called to adapt. God calls us to something even bigger than our most treasured relationships. Again, it doesn't mean we can't treasure those relationships, but it means we're called to something more than just that. He calls us to wholeness, a wholeness that allows us to enjoy our stuff without living for it. He calls us to enjoy our people, our relationships, our family, without clinging to them quite so tightly. He calls us to enjoy our lives, but to embrace growth rather than fighting it. A love that allows us to love fully without clinging. I don't think it's a call to love any less, but it is a call to love because he first loved us. I don't claim to be good at it at all. I still tend to cling. If my children were here, they would roll their eyes when I say, try not to cling. I cried when I put my daughter back on a plane the other day. She's almost 30 years old. It's still hard to let go. I understand. But I hate uncertainty and I hate a lack of control. And the more I see things changing, the more I tend to cling. I think the church can do that sometimes institutionally too. It's hard for us to embrace change. I think of everyone at annual conference talking about paths forward and ways forward. We embrace change and we embrace growth and we become the church and the people that God calls us to be. It's hard sometimes to let things change, but as St. Augustine said, I am a mystery to myself. I wonder how I can ever grow and change and let go of my own desire to control and to cling and to keep things the way they are. But then I look at Mark's placement of the quote. And it might be the hardest of all of them to hear, but I think it also gives us cause for great hope. In the 8th chapter of Mark, Jesus tells Peter that he's going to suffer and die. And like most true friends, Peter tries to stop him. He wants him to find another way to get the job done. We'll see the quote here. Mark tells the story this way. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of God must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. And he said, and we condensed here a little bit because it's long, but he said, "You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." Might be the harshest rendering yet of the saying, right? Why would Jesus come down so hard on Peter, who out of love was just trying to save him, right? When we see a friend in trouble, isn't that what we try to do? We want to intervene, we want to save them. But I think that Jesus might have been frustrated because Peter, like so many of us still today, are so focused on our fear of what's going to happen. He doesn't want Jesus to suffer. He doesn't want Jesus to die, and so he's afraid. But that fear prevents him from hearing and really understanding the rest of what Jesus is saying. Peter misses the most important part. Jesus doesn't just say that he will suffer and die, but also that he will rise again on the 3rd day. And that's critically important to the story, isn't it? Most of us still miss that part too. We fear giving up one way of living because we forget the promise of the next. There is always a promise of abundant life ahead of us when we answer God's call and embrace God's way of living. Like Peter, we want to skip the hard stuff. But if we do, we lose a teachable moment. We lose an opportunity to see life in a new way. We cling. We hoard. We cower sometimes. We don't do the thing we know we're really called to do. Instead, we need to place the hard saying along the promise. I come to give you life, and not just any life, but life abundant. I come to give you abundant life. In the end, I think we need to remember what Peter needed to remember, that Jesus didn't die to teach us how to die. Jesus died to teach us how to rise and to soar and to grow and to change and to transform the world. It's not about the death, it's about the resurrection. We can live bigger lives together in that hope and that promise than we could ever live alone, hoarding our stuff or our talents or our identities. In part, losing life means letting go of the desire that we have to have an easy life or a predictable life or a controllable life. It means letting go of knowing every single thing that's going to happen in the future. It means that life is always going to present challenges, and sometimes we have to be courageous. For me, losing my life means letting go of control, my desire to plan, and trusting that following Jesus is going to take me to the places that I need to be. And how do we know where those places are? John adds a line at the end of the quote in his rendering. In the Gospel of John, right after Jesus says this, John quotes him as adding, "Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also." Where I am, there will my servant be also. So where do we find Jesus right now? I think we find him at Freedom School when we're teaching kids how to read. I think we find him at Haven Street or out in front when we're smoking meat and sharing meals with people who are hungry. I saw someone this morning bringing in racks of clothes that they were donating for the kids at Epworth. I think we'll find Jesus in the hallways of Vacation Bible School this week, chasing down little ones and teaching them about love. We find him in all these places where people are in need and we go to serve. We find Jesus in the fun places too. Read through all of Jesus' miracles. You know how many of them happened at outdoor meals and on boats on lakes? He's in those places too. In the places where we serve and in the places where we celebrate in the summer. I think what we're being asked to do is keep our eyes looking up enough to see God in the places where we serve, the people we serve, in the people we surround ourselves with, in nature. We spoke of that so much in my book group this week, the ways that we see God in the creation, in these little moments of being enchanted by the things that God has done around us. I think this saying is calling us to look up and to see God in all of these places. Ultimately, I don't think that when he says these words, Jesus is asking us what we're willing to die for. I think Jesus is asking us what we're willing to live for. What are you really willing to live for? What matters the most for you? I don't think he's calling us to give things up in order to suffer, but in order to grow, to empty our hands of some things so that we can embrace others. I want to show, let's summarize. We're calling the band back up. The things that he's asking us to let go of. As I was driving the kids back to the airport last week, one of them asked what I was preaching on. And I was explaining that Jesus uses this saying, but he says it in multiple places. And okay, what does he tell us to give up in each of the different 4 Gospels? And as I was riding in the car, I thought it all got jumbled up in my head. So I made a slide. I thought I'd be like, Professor Tim when Tim's up here with his PowerPoints. So let's look. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is telling us to let go of our stuff. It's okay to enjoy our stuff. If you've got a screened-in porch or a favorite place to be in summer, enjoy it. But don't be so focused on your stuff that you don't look up and see God all around you. And then in Matthew, what have we got? It's John, actually. In the Gospel of John, he's calling us to share our talent. Whatever gifts God has given you, the gift of music or teaching or cooking or baking or smoking meat, go out into the world and find a place to share it. Our gifts are only worth something if we share them and make them a part of the broader community. In Matthew, he's asking us to look at our identity and don't be so wrapped up in a particular role, whether it's a role in a family or a career role or a societal role. Don't be so wrapped up in who the world tells you you are, that you can't hear the voice of God calling you to be a disciple, to be a follower. And finally, in the Gospel of Mark, I think he's telling us to let go of fear. That fear that Peter had, that there might be suffering in this process of getting Jesus to the point of resurrection. That's true for us too. Sometimes we have to change in order to grow. We have to chop one tree down in order to make room for the other one to really mature. This allows each of us to live each chapter of life without fear of moving on to the next. Exactly what we need to give up, what we need to die to, is going to be different for each of us. Like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have to make our own meaning of the words, to place them in the context of our own lives, and in doing so, find our own abundant lives that Jesus promises. Will you pray with me? Good and gracious God, we seek our lives and we find them in and through your amazing love for us. Your love that holds us even in times of change. Your love that calls us to be bigger than we ever thought we could be, to be a part of a community that can do something so glorious that it transforms the whole world. And so we surrender to you today. We offer you our hearts, our talents, and we put our trust in you, even as we sing our songs of praise. Amen.